Okay, so let's get into my haves and the have-nots review for this week. This is later than I usually like it to be, but it is what it is. So let's get right into it. So we open the show with Hannah running to the hospital with her grandson. I'm not really sure how far she ran, um, because the cab driver dropped her off halfway to the hospital. So let me think. When I take a cab, it's hmm. When I take a cab, $8 usually is about, I don't know, $8 usually gets about a couple of miles. So I guess she ran about a couple of miles to get to the hospital. So she gets him there, and of course she's frantic, and she asked if she's like asking the nurse what's wrong with him, and clearly they haven't had enough time to examine him, and she said let's let's go, let's just she just basically told her calm down and we'll get you some information when we can get it. So Hannah waits, and later on the doctor comes out and tells her, well, we have little Quincy in ICU. She's like, ICU? And all that. And we find out that he has lupus, and also asthma. The doctor asked her, why hasn't he been taking his medication? She said, well, I didn't know anything about it. I just got custody of him. And she reveals that she's staying in a motel, which is not good for any child, period, but it's especially not good for a child who has an autoimmune disorder. So she she ends up going to work because the doctor says, well, there's nothing you can do here. He can't see anybody till tomorrow. We don't allow anybody into the intensive care unit. So there was nothing Hannah could do but go on. So let's see, where do we go next? So we get into Jeffrey and Wyatt. Now Wyatt, he messes with Jeffrey. He plays around with Jeffrey. He teases Jeffrey with his parents. He's like, he comes out the back with a big old bottle of liquor, and he lays out on the couch and he puts his feet on Jeffrey, and I'm like, you're messing with Jeffrey here. And sometimes there are straight guys who will mess with a gay guy who likes them just because they can. I mean, whatever reason they do that, and okay, so whatever about that. So Jeffrey just tells him this is not good, you getting all this money, because clearly Wyatt getting all this money, he's going to get himself in some trouble, and he's going to end up dead. So Wyatt says, okay, well, I'm going to Brazil, where all the women are. And he says to Jeffrey, come with me. Jeffrey's like, no, I'm not coming. Wyatt's all, well, you don't want to come because I'm not going where the boys are. And Jeffrey's like, well, there are some good-looking men in Brazil, so that's not even the point. Um, so Wyatt goes on to kind of insult Jeffrey, like, I'm, I'm never gonna love you, or all this stuff, and Jeffrey kind of shuts him down and says, you need to learn to love yourself, and if I loved you enough, you wouldn't be like this. Something like that. I can't remember exactly what the line was. So Jeffrey, he leaves Wyatt there at the Choir Mansion, leaves him blasting music and just being like immature. Jeffrey goes back to Candace's place. I don't know what his intention was for going over there, but that nosy neighbor, she is watching. She sees Jeffrey getting ready to knock on the door. She's all, well, aren't you gonna knock? And she's got two men in there with her. And I'm like, what business is this of yours? She's just way too nosy. I mean, there are nosy neighbors, but she takes it to a whole other level. And I just don't think she wants any black people in the neighborhood. She's not saying it out loud. Still in the same uh, clothes that he killed Quincy in, and there's blood on his shirt and whatever. And so, off of that, let's talk about Quita. So Quita, she gets a phone call from the police saying, "Do you know a Jeffrey Harrington, or do you know why a Jeffrey Harrington would have your car?" She's like, "No." They tell her that there's blood in her car, all this stuff. She don't know what's going on because all she knows is that Quincy took her car last and he's not answering. So her helper, he's found a car that's suitable to go into the neighborhood, and so they're going to head on over there and try to figure out what happened to Quincy. Now Quincy has been buried in Candace's backyard, courtesy of Benny. Um, Candace was like, well, what if he starts to smell? And Benny's like, oh, well, he's buried too deep for any of that to happen. But, you know, this is going to come to light at some point. Um, Benny was getting stuff from his tow yard to bury Quincy. He had a shovel and all this stuff. And his business partner, Mitch, he's like, what's going on here? And he's angry because Benny has left him to do all this towing work, and you know, because Benny doesn't have any help except for Mitch and himself. They're the only ones that can do all these tow jobs. So clearly, Mitch is angry. And Benny's like, "I'll be back in a couple of hours," and he does the burying for Candace, and Candace is she's just like so relieved that Benny did this for her, and the way she just doesn't even seem to care that she could get her brother in trouble is just like it's very telling about how selfish Candace can be. So Candace decides to get a little bit of something going. She says, "Benny, you can get rich. The guy that hit you was Wyatt Cryer, and you can sue that family for millions and win." And then she decides to put Hannah um, in it and say, "Well, Mama knew who hit you, and she kept it from you." And Benny's like, "She knew who hit me?" And Candace doesn't have any way of knowing what Hannah knew. We know, like a couple of seasons ago, Hannah was suspicious that Wyatt had hit Benny and was going to go to the police, but then Jim came up with that whole scheme of getting that Norman guy to take the fall for Wyatt, and so that pushed all that to the back burner. Candace doesn't know any of this, so she pretty much is lying to get to force a rift between Benny and Hannah. So um, it's gonna be good when that comes to a head. Now, what else happened? Okay, so David and Veronica. Veronica wants David to get her out, and he won't get her out unless she tells him where she lives. And she's like, "Why do you want to know?" Blah blah blah, all that. And he says, "You're not getting out unless you tell me where you live." And we know that David wants to know this because Veronica has a hit out on her, and if she goes home, it's pew. She won't tell him, and then she starts being real snarky. I live with my man, and all that. And I said, Veronica, this is not gonna help you get out of there. And obviously David just gives up and he says, you know what? And he just leaves. And then she's all, don't leave, and is trying to cry. And I'm like, Veronica, you're crazy. Just a couple of seconds ago you were playing games with him, and now you're on the verge of crying because he's left you there in the jailhouse. So Veronica is messed up seriously. So what we, as far as David goes, what we see next is he goes over to his hotel room and he sees that the adjoining door is open. The adjoining door to Maggie's room is open. And he goes into Maggie's room and he's like, oh. And she's like, oh, David, I'm so sorry. And David's not hearing any of it. He just tells her to take off her clothes. And so they start going at it, and Maggie was thirsty, not even thirsty, but dehydrated. She was just really into this. And so after they finish up, David is like, okay, well, Veronica and I are getting a divorce, but yet he says what happened between him and Maggie just now was a mistake, and as like David is a game player. So what happens next is he asks her, he asks her if she has any, he's trying to figure out if she has any diseases, and I'm like, kind of a fine time to ask that question, David. It'd be too late to do anything about it if Maggie did have a disease. Then he asks her about, are you on the pill? And she says, no, I'll get the morning after pill. And he was, well, I can get it for you, but she insists on getting it, but Maggie's not going to get it. She clearly would want to get pregnant to have a better connection to David. And he makes it clear that he thinks what they did was a mistake. And he says, I used you, and she's like, use me again. Like, Maggie has no pride at all. Just dehydrated. But I think I covered everything. If I missed anything, I'm sorry about that. But that's been my review of the haves and the have-nots. Tune in next week for another review, and rate and comment on this video if you